By the way, I'm Maxime Forest. I'm one of your two trainers for today's session. With Francisco.
I am Francisco, Maxime's co-trainer for the morning.
Okay, if Francisco is okay, I think we should start, although there are not so many people yet.
For me.
Okay, so let's start. So again, we are very pleased to have you on board for this half of the session as part of the Gender Equality Academy. This morning and very early afternoon, we will address how to develop gender-sensitive curricula, especially in STEM fields, and in particular through identifying needs and building strategies for integrating a gender perspective in academic curricula. So as I said, I'm one of your co-trainer. I'm Maxime Forest from Yellow Window, acting here for the Gender Equality Academy. I'm also a gender scholar. I myself had to deal with the issue of integrating gender in curricula in my home university. So I will be able also to share maybe some practical hints during our discussion. Francisco, maybe I'll let you introduce yourself.
I am Francisco. I'm here on behalf of Gender Equality Academy. My previous experiences as in an implementing team of gender equality plan at the University of Coimbra. So I've been involved in various sides of constructing a gender sensitive university, and so curricula are a bit of a part of that.
Part of that picture, yeah, true. So maybe a couple of words to start about the Gender Equality Academy as such. So the objective of this youth-funded initiative is to develop and implement consistent and as much as possible high-quality capacity building program on gender equality in research and innovation, that is for both research performing organizations, including universities, and research funding organizations. It is meant to be based on state-of-the-art knowledge and expertise on the different fields that we cover through the topics of those capacity building activities, but also in terms of how it is to be delivered practically and in terms of method. So we provide training material which are, again, as far as possible, tailor-made to the needs of different target groups in particular, including decision makers, human resource and gender equality or diversity officers, but also senior researchers, project managers, people dealing with research valorization and dissemination, and people involved in designing curricula as it is the case today. For that, we use different formats, which are quite variegated, although the COVID-19 situation obviously led us to switch everything online for now, but that has been also a source of innovation for us. So theoretically, we deliver in-person trainings, what we can't do today, unfortunately. Workshops, which are usually more focused in terms of scope and shorter as well. Webinars that have expanded ultimately to a lot more format online due to the situation, and summer schools that are meant to be delivered using a combination of the different capacity building activities carried out as part of Gender Equality Academy. You see here a slight difference, but I think it will not apply because with respect to the agendas that was put online and on the basis of which you registered, there was a slight discrepancy of 15 minutes for the key lessons of the day. But I think that provided we are not many this morning, some part will go a little bit faster and we will be able to end on time sharply. So we are in the welcome and introduction part, and then we will address some definitions so as to have a common ground for starting this session. We will also go through the different biases that exist in producing knowledge at universities, because from knowledge production to knowledge transfer through teaching and through curricula, there is a logical connection. And we will also discuss briefly the notion of unconscious bias. And then we will move to a more, quite quickly to a more hands-on approach. We will work in, I think, just a couple of smaller groups, so as to map a little bit the process for developing curricula, where gender bias can occur and how they can possibly be fixed, and also thinking strategically to the different challenges that you may have faced or you may face in the future while integrating this gender perspective in curricula, how to face them in a practical way. That will be our journey for today. Okay, so let's start with a few definitions, and we will do that together with Francisco. When it comes to definition, actually, it's always a little bit frustrating. It's frustrating for for some reasons. To those who have like more extensive knowledge on gender, the definition that we provide to get a common ground at the beginning of a session can be considered a little bit too operational and not so theoretical. But to those who are not so familiar, they might look for more theory and be frustrated as well by this operational aspect. But nevertheless, we feel always the need, whatever is your background on those topics, to agree about a few basic definitions that will support our analysis of the problems at stake and of how to solve them. So that's very much the purpose of it. And it's more important than theory yet. So what we suggest first is to retain some distinction between the sex and gender categories, although this distinction itself can be sometimes the object of the discussion. We need here for analytical purpose to distinguish both, and that's important. So if we have to distinguish between the two notions in quite simple terms, we will tend to present sex as what refers to the biologically determined characteristics of men and women, notably in terms of reproductive organs and functions, which are based, as we know, on chromosomal complement and physiology. So it is usually what is understood as a classification of living things either as male or female. But when we have said that, immediately from experience or from your research or from your training and from the picture of life, we know that while sex is rather fixed as a category, it cannot be fully encapsulated into this binarity. Why? Because nature itself is more complex than this, and that there are more like subtle categorization than those male and female categories. And that applies to a number of living things, including human being. But for the sake of clarity and of also explaining why gender is not the same thing as sex, we need to stay on this quite generic level of the definition of sex. So if sex is what refers to the biologically determined, mostly, that can be changed with human intervention, that can change also along the life, because hormones and so on do not play the same game along the life of human beings, then gender refers to the social construction of women and men as categories of femininity and masculinity. And this varies much more across time and place than sex definition. It varies also between cultures. And as a concept, gender is therefore more fluid than sex. This is something which is less fixed and stable. But again, just as I just mentioned that sex was fixed but not completely binary, gender change, but it takes time. So it is always needed to relativize this distinction while showing that it exists, and that's important, especially for our discussion. So we know that gender roles change over time, unfortunately, and this is we are witness of that on a daily basis. But we know also that usually it takes quite some time because those gender norms are deeply entrenched in the way our societies work, whatever society we are in. So something we can add is that no matter where we live, no matter in which cultural background we have, there is always a gendered organization of the society, gendered distribution of work, notably at universities, for instance. And that applies everywhere, although how this organization is structured, how it works, can be different from a country to another, from a discipline at university to another, and we will see that. But there is always this gendered structuration of our social environment.
And so gender and sex are part of an entire part of our identity. As Maxime mentioned, there's biological sex, which is very much related and usually encapsulated in this binarity, but still in the spectrum, as you can see, for example, in this gender-bred person model that combines all four of these dimensions we are going to speak of. That goes from female to male, but there are all sorts of variabilities in intersex, even in the biological sex characteristics. And then we go to gender identity, which has been explored by Maxime, that defines the gender roles in society. I identify as male, identify as female, or I identify as somewhere in between. I don't identify as anything. There are various ways to go about this, and how we express that gender, that notion of ourselves, how it is interpreted by those around us and the structures around us is the gender expression. The type of clothes we wear, the mannerisms we have, the way we speak and express ourselves in various different capabilities. And then finally, who am I attracted to? The sexual orientation. Of course, we know the heterosexual and the homosexual side of the spectrum, but then there's fluidity in this, there's bisexuality. And so this metaphor of the gender-bred person essentially equates to our identity, our gender identity in our brains, how we think about ourselves, how we see ourselves, the orientations we love, it's in our art, in our crotch zone, the sex, who are we attracted to, and the expression is how we express our bodies and our movements in space, express the way we see ourselves and want to be presented as. So this is a very basic understanding of things that most of you might be aware of, but it's always good to remind and to be on a common ground when we are discussing sex, because sex and gender, as we progress towards a more practical approach.
And there are notions which are often related to gender, especially when we move to the practical, to the operational part of it. That is to the fact of changing the way an organization like a university functions. And those concepts are, for instance, diversity. Diversity is meant to be a positive value because it brings a different perspectives and experience of life that can inform decision, that can inform innovation, research, that can also inform the knowledge that is being transferred to students, for instance. and that also correspond to the reality of life. We are always diverse crowds, and even when they look homogeneous, they are not as homogeneous as we think, because we all have different experiences of life, we have different ages, we have different social backgrounds, we may have different abilities or health conditions, and all of that shape our vision of the world. And this is something that can be properly addressed, or which often take place, that can be neglected, forgotten, left unaddressed, or even considered a problem, which leads to forging a more uniform approach to life, or to teaching, or to research, for instance. That is, trying to take out the diversity which exists in every given society, and shaping solutions, shaping teaching contents, shaping innovations for a common denominator which does not exist, because we are not common denominator, we are human beings. And this we can experience in many conditions, when we see that something, a content, a visual, a technical device has been crafted for a majority, or for what is thought to be the majority, and does not fit our own purpose, or understanding, or cognitive capacities. So this is why it is important also to take into account this notion of diversity, trying to avoid uniformity. Another concept which is related to gender equality, and which is being much discussed ultimately, is intersectionality. And without getting into the normative or theoretical discussion about it, what is important is to acknowledge a basic fact. Every person is a mosaic of identity grounds and experiences, I will add as well. We can be man or woman, or feeling uncomfortable in defining ourselves in one of the two categories, but for most of us, we define in one or the other. We can be old or young, we can be rich or poor, we can be married, divorced, single, etc., etc. We can have different abilities, as I said, sexualities, use different language on a daily basis, have different cultures, background, ethnicities, which are visible on us, and all of that can combine. Obviously, we are not as much intersectional as, we are not as much, not everyone is as much intersectional as the other. It depends on your background. I'm certainly less intersectional than other people, but nevertheless, we have different grounds of identity crossing in us. Why do we actually need those definitions? Because they reflect how life is. People have intersecting factors of identity that can matter more or less to themselves. They have to position themselves in terms of sex, gender, and all the different layers that Francisco mentioned. And this defines us on a daily basis. This is something we struggle, or we deal with every single day of our lives, no matter we realize it or not. And what we see is that it is not being taken so much into account. And that's the case, for instance, when we define teaching content about a particular area or topic, we usually drop the diversity of experience and identities that people have, therefore their different needs, and this is usually left quite unaddressed, and this can lead ultimately to biased contents, as we will see soon enough. So let's have a global picture of what is behind the scene, and what has led to potentially biased teaching content and biased curriculums, which is our topic of the day. One big thing is that there is still a masculine image of, let's say, knowledge production. Let's put it like this rather than science. Science is about producing knowledge. This knowledge is about to be transferred to people through teaching and capacity building activities. When you type in whatever language, and that would be, of course, worse if you use a language that does not so frequently distinguish between male and female tense for scientific professions. But as here in Spanish, científicos famosos, you end up with an overwhelmingly male picture of knowledge production. Of course, there is an algorithm, Google's one, behind, and the algorithm might be biased itself, but nevertheless, it quite faithfully reflects the picture that most people have of knowledge production activities in the world, something that has historically corresponded to men. And if it has corresponded to men historically, because women were excluded from higher education, for instance, or simply because they were not considered fit for activities, for intellectual activities, for some ideological or religious reasons, it is quite logical that the institutions like universities, like academies of science, like schools, higher education schools that have been shaped since the Middle Ages to transfer the knowledge and to produce it are quite biased themselves. They have been built around a masculine vision of knowledge production and ultimately relatively androcentric, so male-centered vision of life, of the experience of people, of the needs of the societies, of the functioning of the body. That's pretty understandable. And this ultimately has led to a situation in which research, that is knowledge production, is often depicted either as gender blind, that is not taking into account potential sex differences, as well as the gendered roles and conduct of women and men in societies, or even gender biased, which is a consequence of gender blindness, because gender blindness is not a neutral operation. If you fail to take into account those differences that comes either from bodies, from nature, or from which type of roles and realities we have in life, like, for instance, women endorsing still nowadays over 85% of care activities, not only towards children, but also towards people who are dependent, to the elderly people, to the sick people. And we see that perfectly in this COVID-19 situation that we experience today. Then the hypotheses which are built, the reflection conceptualization models which are built around those hypotheses, the research protocols which are designed, the research experiments which are being conducted, the tests which are being delivered might be biased in terms of genders by not taking into account this very basic feature of human lives. And this is actually what happened. So there are many famous examples from different fields. First, I will take a couple from the medical research field, and then later from the STEM field. If we take on the left the example of the different symptoms of heart failure, you can use the chat box maybe. What would you tell about cardiovascular diseases and sex and or gender? Any idea popping up to your mind? Do you see any connection between cardiovascular diseases in general, heart failure being one, the consequence of some of them, and sex and or gender? Do you see any relation between both? And you can use the chat box or just like step in the discussion. Francisco, do you mind to check with the chat box if there is
Yes.
any idea shared?
There's still no contribution.
Yeah, I see. We need a little bit of your input here. I mean, what we know usually, not being medical researchers, is that for very long, cardiovascular diseases have been mostly associated to men due to their health habits, exposure to professional stress, more heavy drinking, more widespread smoking habits, lower like weaker prevention relation to health prevention than women, and men have been the overwhelming majority of the victims of cardiovascular disease for quite some decades. But we know also that this has changed. It has changed because women got involved in paid work on the top of the unpaid work they are usually delivering. So they were exposed to new type of substances, new type of risk factors, including professional stress. They have been also starting to smoke much more widely and to drink in bigger proportions. And this ended up with women suffering cardiovascular disease, still to a lesser extent than men, but to quite an extent. And the problem is that medical research did not take that into account so much. For instance, at the time of addressing the symptoms of a heart failure. And the symptoms you see on this picture are completely different from the one which are usually associated to the male pattern of heart failure. There is an epidemiological consequence to that. Women are still less at risk of suffering cardiovascular diseases than men. But when a heart failure occurs, they are much more at risk of dying from it, simply because their symptoms are not properly identified and addressed. And that's one of the reasons of it. On the other side of the slide, you see the difference in cancer risk exposure by age for an exposure to 20 millisievert radiation, which is a mild level of radiation. And although it is a mild level, we see already quite a substantial difference in terms of exposure. And here it might be linked to the conditions of the exposure, so maybe something related to the gender division of work, but most likely in this case it is more related to sex, with a smaller muscular mass, which leads to getting the exposure more harmful. Yes, Melanie and Vicky mentioned this question of the lack of promotion of early examination of women at risk of suffering cardiovascular diseases, and also the unrecognized heart attack and the problem with early detection. That's one of the two of the reasons explaining a difference in not in risk exposure, but in exposure to a fatality in suffering those heart failures. And could we ask you to give us maybe some example of gender biases which are quite widespreadly discussed and more specific to the STEM fields? Especially for those of you coming from science, technologies, engineering, and mathematics, but do not hesitate to provide other type of examples, if you have any. Don't need to be much elaborated. We need just you to share. Sorry, I'm giving you part of the answer or one.
Just Maria, as you were writing, Maxim was saying STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics.
Sí, ciencias, tecnologías, ingeniería y matemáticas. Yeah, lack of suites for women astronauts. Thank you, Margoshata. Yes, good example.
Design of phones.
Yeah, the design of phones, yes. And Rajan's sharing many the examples coming from Caroline Criado Perez's book. Yes, indeed. Yeah, the number of examples like is very extensive, and sometimes they end up to be quite funny because they reveal the extent of the gender blindness. I mean, you know, sending people, you train people to get into the space. It costs you literally billions dollars or euros, and not even talking about rubles. You train them for years. You pass a number of tests that, by the way, can be certainly gender biased as well, and leaving a number of things undetected or unaddressed. And at the end, you just like let them go into the space in one of the most hostile environment for human beings in astronaut suits which are not fitting their bodies. I mean, that's close to ridiculous, to be honest. But this ridiculousness, believe me, is happening on a number of topics, and you mentioned a few ones. Algorithm is also one of those many very often mentioned example, because while people involved in IT research and in developing algorithm tend to believe that an algorithm is neutral, is not gendered, it's just like figures and a way to manage data and so on. Yet there are, as it is put here, biases involved at every single step of developing and implementing an algorithm. There are technical biases like omitting variables, like drawing upon databases which are, for instance, completely gender blind or gender biased. There is a bias in selecting the data, because you do select data to involve it in developing the algorithm, and this selection process can be worded differently. When you choose data between two, we use the word discrimination in English to depict this operation of the brain. It's discrimination. So discrimination is considering something more valuable than another thing. And this is what you do on a daily basis when you develop an algorithm, which can involve race or gender-based discrimination.
Maxim, if I might intervene, just to also maybe help Maria in her work regarding crime prevention. I think it has ended this year, but there's a European research project exactly on how crime prevention algorithms are biased, not only in terms of gender, but intersectionality. For example, we'll talk later about face detection, but there are some very practical and poignant cases that are being put out there at the moment that we might share with you later on. Yes, I will share with you this. I will find it and I will share with you maybe in the break.
Thank you very much. And indeed, along with those technical bias, you have all these societal biases, which are led also to the process. And here we see around from developing, collecting the data, labeling the data, use, obviously, that can be pretty biased as well. The feedback that you collect to improve the functioning of your algorithm, and during which you can just like overlook whole portion of the population, not talking about management, that is who is making the decision about the development of your algorithm. Google one, for instance. And just as Francisco just mentioned, you have indeed documented bias in algorithm for facial recognition, which are both race-based and gender-based, and the combination or intersection of both race or ethnic background with gender ends up with the largest gaps in terms of facial recognition efficiency. And this is not a mathematical question. This is a question of how you put the data into the process. So it's a human-based question. So if knowledge production is biased, it's because there is a gendered pattern of knowledge disciplinary areas in the academia. Disciplines have been built according to different contribution and add knowledge contribution of men and women. But that's also because there are unconscious bias, which leads to this gender blindness and gender bias research. And here I'll let Francisco maybe to develop.
Of course. And so this is what could be called first principles approach to what leads to gender bias, which that is the cognitive biases we are subjected to. They are mostly unconscious because most of us at least don't want to make mistakes while we process, while we think about things either more systematically or as we just tackle the world and we move from things tasks that we require to do and that we somehow complicate them. And here we can see this codex that has 170 different types of biases we are subjected to based on 4 dimensions, things we should remember, or maybe we have to process too much information, maybe we need to act fast, and then we resort to our previous experiences, for example, or we do not have enough meaning on the information, on the data we have. You can move on, Maxime.
Yes,
thank you.
I do as soon as I get control over it.
Maybe exactly. So this unconscious bias occurs when we make judgments, decisions on the basis of prior experiences, as I mentioned, deep-seated thought patterns. The way we think about things is very important to this matter, how we systematize. Have we experienced that? Have we confronted, reflected our reality, our thought patterns with others? And we are not even aware most of the times that we're resorting to these patterns and these biases that we might have instilled in us, both personally, individually, but also as social groups, for example. And this is that, and why do they happen? It's because human cognition is very efficient. We think fast, we develop strategies to do things, to act quickly. What happens is that we sometimes discriminate against others, against ourselves. And I don't think we are going to show it now. Yes, we don't have the time, but there are very interesting resources in literature, in videos, YouTube articles that you can go to. For example, the Nobel winning work of Daniel Kahneman, Think Fast, Think Slow, is a very thorough analysis of how bias occurs in human processes. So I think we can move on as we are getting short on time, Maxime.
Yeah, slightly, but that's still quite manageable. Yeah, just like maybe to address a couple of questions that were posted. If Malgorzata asking whether you will receive later the slides, yes, they are provided directly by a Gender Equality Academy back office. And Maria Biela was still providing other examples of gender blindness. For instance, when a database does not collect any data about sexual-based violence crimes connected to main crimes. Well, this is a very good example because sexual violence and sex-related crimes are very widespread in Europe, and they are less well documented than many other categories that have been, again, crafted around male patterns of criminality and of victimology as well. So men have been privileged both as victims and perpetrators in terms of setting up data set. And this is something that all, for instance, European member states are still facing today. Okay, here I think I need to stop sharing the screen so that I can show you how we're gonna work with the first exercise. Our first exercise will be to start identifying and tackling gender bias in teaching curricula. Maybe it's good to just to encapsulate that very briefly before we pass to the more hands-on part of our training. So when it comes to identifying gender biases that may apply to curricula, we should be aware that teaching is about transferring knowledge, and therefore teaching is also subject to gender and other potential biases. We should be also aware that there are both common patterns to gender bias, that is, common patterns along which they usually occur, but those might be also area specific, so specific to areas of knowledge like STEM, like computer sciences more specifically, and bias in architecture, gender bias in architecture can be different from those in information system, for instance. There are biases which occur in classroom, so during interaction with students, in the way we organize the work with the class, in the way we deliver the knowledge, in the way we listen to people and to students interacting, in the way we evaluate them, in the way they evaluate us as teachers, and they are as much biased as we are. There are many data about that we can share later on. But there are also biases which are embedded in the way curricula themselves are designed. And that's why it's a complex endeavor, but a very important one, to look at the way the knowledge which is made available for being transferred to students, whoever the students are, whatever the discipline is very important to be reviewed from a gender perspective to prevent those biases.